the long line that snaked into the airport today here in Los Angeles. Okay, everybody was commenting that in this long line, everybody was so polite. Everybody was so kind.
Well, let me. I'm sorry to interrupt. Let me, if I may.
So phenomenal. Sure, you may.
Thank you, sir. One religious leader said this yesterday, and I just want just react to it, okay? Here's the quote. It's from Jerry Falwell. I really believe that, he's talking about why this happened. He said, I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, the People for American Way, all of them who have tried to secularize America, I'd point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen. That's what he said. What do you say?
Oh, I don't want to interpret his comments. I can't relate to it in a spirit that would probably do justice, and I probably would have to. I'm not going there. I'm going to go to Jesus Christ because I'm a follower of Christ. And what's so shocking to me is that not only the Muslims, but many of my Jewish friends respect Jesus Christ. And if we see the God of love in him, let's focus on that. I do believe that our country is going to become strong as we come back to God and back to morality. I do think this is going to impact our culture. I think that it's going to impact the depravity that is in the culture, and that's, I think, that what Jerry was pointing to. But let's be positive. Let's come back to a faith that is positive and loving and caring, so that this caring compassion that we see all over America and in the world today. I have a global telecast, as you probably know, and I've been getting telephone calls from Holland. They're weeping on the telephone for us. And in Germany and in the Orient, the world is weeping tonight. And only people who have the capacity to love will weep the way they're weeping. And the world is sad. Yes.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I thought you'd finished. I thought you'd finished. I apologize.
You've got to cut me off. I'm a preacher.
Well, then I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it very carefully and very gently, if you don't mind. Thank you for joining us. You can't fault me for trying to draw you into this discussion with Reverend Falwell. I gave it my best effort. It's nice to talk to you, sir.
Thank you.
Robert Schuller joined us from Los Angeles with his thoughts on how we might look at this theologically. We want, as we just clear the top of the hour, 2 minutes past the hour, update you on some of the latest developments. And first among them, the cockpit voice recorder, one of the black boxes on the plane that crashed in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, has now been found. That's the voice recorder, and it has now been found. You might recall that that's the plane where it is speculated, at least, that the pilots, or the passengers rather, tried to overpower the hijackers, and it is possible we may learn something about why that plane went down from that black box. That's just coming in. Also late tonight, the Pentagon revised downward the number of people presumed dead in the crash at the Pentagon, down from 190 to 189. Anti-drop is good news. One person had been counted twice, as it turns out. Meanwhile, sources at the Pentagon tell us at least 4 Air Force fighter jets scrambled to intercept the hijacked passenger planes in the skies on Tuesday, of course, all arriving too late. And details are emerging about the first arrest stemming from the attacks. The Justice Department says the possible material witness was one of the people detained at Kennedy Airport yesterday has been arrested. More on that from our Justice Department correspondent, Kelly Arena. Kelly.
Aaron, 2 men in INS custody in Texas are being transported to New York City tonight for further questioning in the investigation of the terrorist incidents. Now, government sources say the 2 have been very helpful in moving the investigation forward, and they have detailed knowledge of the terrorist network. The men were taken into custody on Wednesday as they were traveling on an Amtrak train. The 2 had been traveling without legal identification and carrying box cutters. Now, that is the same type of weapon that the FBI device says was used by some of the hijackers. Now, it has been reported that the pair was traveling on Tuesday on a flight from Newark bound for San Antonio when the plane was grounded in St. Louis due to the hijackings. The men later got on a train bound for San Antonio. Now, that train was stopped on Wednesday by police request, and the pair was pulled off. Now, this development follows another in New York that we told you about earlier, where the first arrest has been made in direct connection to Tuesday's terrorist attacks. An individual who was detained at JFK Airport in New York is in custody on a material witness warrant. Now, what that is a material witness warrant is only issued when it can be demonstrated that there's information that is highly relevant to a criminal investigation and when there's a risk of flight. Law enforcement sources say to expect similar arrests in coming days. So very quickly, Aaron, we are seeing this investigation move forward.
Kelly, thanks. It does seem to be moving forward very quickly. All of this does, just in the hour that we've been on the air tonight. A number of things that have happened, including that. Thank you for your work again. Can we help me on this, guys? Has the House vote? The House is okay. The Senate earlier today voted on a use of force resolution, and there were no dissenting votes in the Senate. In the House tonight, the House has just now finished that vote, and we see one no vote. That column that says NV is non-voting or not voting. 388 yes on the use of force resolution. It's kind of a complicated technical legal document, and one vote against, and we'll try one Democrat. We know it's a Democrat. We don't yet know who. We'll figure that out in a moment or so, but that vote is now complete, and the president has the authorization he was seeking to essentially go after the people he believes are responsible for this and those who may have harbored them. That is very much shorthand for what that resolution allows the president to do. That vote just finishing up in the House now. Now, we take a break. That is to say, we take a break and turn things over to our colleague, Jeff Greenfield, our senior analyst who joins us here in New York with a number of guests and a number of conversations. Jeff.
Thank you, Aaron. Three things have been said almost from the moment that those towers went up. First, that America has changed forever. Second, that this is not the end of terrorist attacks. And third, that the only way to stop these attacks is to root out not only the terrorists, but the states that support them. We're going to be talking about that with three guests very knowledgeable in these fields. Judith Miller is an investigative reporter for the New York Times. She has written, among other things, about the world of Islam. Her most recent book, co-authored with two other New York Times reporters, is about germ warfare. Also with me in New York is Zev Chafetz. He is a columnist for the New York Daily News. He was for 30 years a resident of Israel and served for 5 years as director of the government press office in the prime ministership of Menachem Begin. Also in Washington with us is L. Paul Bremer. He served as ambassador at large for counterterrorism in the Reagan administration. He chaired what was the National Commission on Terrorism. He's now a senior advisor on politics and emerging risk for Marsh McLennan Incorporated. Mr. Bremer, I understand, just as a dark footnote, that many of your colleagues in that company are as yet unaccounted for. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. We are still missing many hundreds of our employees.
Well, words can't express what we feel about that, but let me turn to the larger issues, if I might. You wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal in which you said we must punish not just the terrorists, but any group or state that in any way supported them. I'd like to put some meat on the bones of that, if I might. Say the Taliban is protecting bin Laden and say he is found responsible for what happened. Pakistan provides assistance to the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. China just signed an economic and development deal with the Taliban. How far do you mean that statement to go when you say we must punish any state that in any way supports the terrorists?
Well, I think in the case you give, we obviously would include the Taliban, and that's the primary target. Pakistan is in a difficult position, and if we understand what has been announced this afternoon, the Pakistanis have decided to join us in the campaign, whatever it's going to be, to root out terrorism in Afghanistan. With the Chinese, it seems to me, our position should be that we want them to cut off all relations with the Taliban at a minimum and to join us in our efforts to destroy terrorism in Afghanistan.
But by punishment, in the case of, let's say China does not do what you suggest, or you are not, I take it, suggesting military action, but rather economic sanctions, other punishment short of force?
Look, the United States is going to have a strategy that operates on three different levels. There's the immediate level of what to do about bin Laden and the Taliban. There is another ring around that, which is the level where you go after, actively go after people who are actively supporting terrorists. I have in mind countries like Iran, Iraq, and particularly Syria, which still gives succor and safe haven to terrorists. And then you have outside that a broader ring, which is to try to build an international consensus that says terrorism is unacceptable. And the Chinese, in the case you posit, are in the third ring here. We want them to say it's no longer acceptable to have those kinds of relations with a government like that of the Taliban.
The question about Afghanistan, an Afghani writer living in San Francisco wrote an interesting column. He describes himself as somebody who hates the Taliban, hates Osama bin Laden. He suggests the Taliban, in effect, are an occupying hostile force in Afghanistan, that the people do not support them, that bombing will not work against a country that has successfully resisted everybody from the Brits to the Russians or the Soviets, and that the only way to really get him is to actually land ground forces in Afghanistan and wage a protracted war. Are you in agreement that that may have to happen if the United States is to do what you want?
I'm afraid I am in agreement. I think that is probably what is going to happen. It is true that the Taliban are not universally loved. They are all Pathans. The Pathans make up less than half the population in Afghanistan, and they're certainly not loved by the other tribes, particularly the tribes north of the Hindu Kush Mountains. So there is something to work with within Afghanistan, but it's not going to be enough to get rid of the Taliban. We're going to have to probably do that ourselves.
All right. Let me turn for a few minutes to Judith Miller. First, is there any doubt in your mind that what happened Tuesday is the work of Osama bin Laden? And can we say that, do you think, with some certainty?
Well, I think the administration, Jeff, has kind of said that. And beyond that, you know, since I'm not an intelligence agency, I think that certainly corresponded to my gut feeling about this.
Fair enough. So let me move on. One of the things that has been said again and again and again is this was a failure of intelligence, particularly the failure to use what is called human intelligence. We relied too much on electronic intercepts, relied too much on satellites. We needed people to infiltrate Osama bin Laden and his cohorts. On a difficulty scale of 1 to 10, how hard would that have been for us to have done that?
Oh, I think about a 9.5. I mean, it's Jerry knows this because he's lived and worked in Afghanistan in a previous life. But I have visited there, and this is extremely difficult country in which to work as a foreigner. And I think that what I saw from our Arab allies is that they were in a much better position to do that than American intelligence. I mean, blonde, blue-eyed American shows up and says, "Hi, I'm here with company X, Y, or Z, and I'm here to help you." And the Taliban immediately think, CIA. So this is not easy work.
But just to try to explore the complexity of this, if we were to turn to one of the moderate Arab states we consider allies, and ask them to go after Osama bin Laden, does that not put some risks on their shoulders, given the support for radical Islam in some of their own countries?
Well, I think it does, but I also think that the mood in those states has dramatically changed in the past 2 or 3 years.
How so?
Well, I think the Millennium bombing plot, the effort to ring in the new year in a, quote, Islamic way, that Osama bin Laden's networks attempted to stage, really galvanized a lot of American allies in the Middle East and showed them that if they didn't fight this kind of terror, they themselves would become the victims of it. I can only tell you that in previous articles that I've written, I worked very closely with some Middle Eastern intelligence officials who had rather good information about what Osama bin Laden was up to and his networks. And that information was enormously helpful in many cases to the Americans.
So the statement that we, the United States or the West, must root and branch terrorism and its supporters within the Arab world, within the Near East, within many other countries. I mean, it sounds as if what you're saying is, without the support of our Arab allies, without their wholehearted support, this is not this is a prescription that can't work.
I don't think you can do it without their wholehearted support, and that, in fact, is part of the problem. Wholehearted, because some of our Arab allies want to have things both ways. On one hand, they want to work with us quietly, secretly, against terrorism in their own countries and directed at the West. And on the other hand, they want to be, quote, on the right side of the street, the Arab street. That is, they want to identify with the causes that Osama bin Laden and people like him attempt to tap into.
So when you hear Pakistan, for instance, say, we're on your side, we utterly condemn this, we will help you, ought we to take that with a grain of salt?
I think we ought to be hopeful that they mean what they say, but once again, having worked there, Pakistan is a country whose secular government, they are even embarrassed about calling themselves that, but this is a government that is deeply torn. It is very full of factions and sympathizers with the Islamists. Their intelligence service is penetrated. It's going to be very hard for them to pull this off.
All right, let me turn that as a Chaffetz, and I want to start with a specific subject about which you wrote, and that has to do with the issue of airline security in the United States. We've heard it probably 1,000 times said that, you know, that we now have to become, every American airline has to become El Al, which hasn't had a hijacking in 30 years. They rigorously search bags, they do interviews. Can we do that?
No, I don't think so.
Why not?
First of all, Israel has only one airport, has only one international airport, only one airline, only several airlines traveling in and out. America has thousands of airports. And besides that, El Al security is not a matter of technique, it's a matter of philosophy. It takes into account that there are potentially dangerous people getting on planes. And it treats people, passengers, as potential suspects. Or as potential danger, security danger.
Well, I don't see, yes.
That will,
we could do that.
At best, that will take hours and hours of preparatory time for flights. It will slow down the American economy. But beyond that, it's not really the issue, because America is a country with tens of thousands of targets. If terrorists find that, if there were security at airports, I mean real security, which would cost a fortune and which would take an enormous amount of effort, but if that were to happen, terrorists would go to the train station. They'd go to the nearest high school. They'd go to the ball game.
It does raise this issue of locking the barn door after the horse is gone. That is, I've seen all these stories of incredibly tightened security, American airports, curbside check-ins, and the like. And I have to admit, I thought to myself, yeah, but it's not likely that the next terrorist will do what the last one.
Of course not. Right now there are buildings all over Manhattan and all over the East Coast and all over the country that are wide open. After the World Trade Center, there's no security in genuine terms.
So you're talking
here.
about somebody walking into Penn Station, which obviously has no security.
Grand Central or any place. And the issue is that you can't deal with terrorism. There are probably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, Arabs, Muslims, who are prepared to carry out terrorist acts in this country. You can't deal with terrorism by picking them off one at a time. It's an impossibility.
And so instead?
You have to go to the source.
And the source is?
The source, first of all, are the countries that support terrorism, and they are Syria, Iran, and Iraq, and probably Iran and Iraq most importantly, and maybe Syria, because they have the potential to have nuclear weapons.
Zev, when you say we must go to them, what do you mean?
I mean that it's December 8th, 1941, and people are saying, what should we do about Japan? There are 100 million Japanese, there are 100 million Germans. How can we ever conquer these countries? It's impractical. We should fire a missile. We should go after the commander of the Japanese Navy. That's nonsense. America is going to have to go in, dismantle and disarm these insane governments, and the terrorists that they support, or the next attack on this city, or the one after, ask Judy, will be a biological or a nuclear attack, and it won't be 5,000 dead, it will be 500,000 dead.
Mr. Bremer, I think what Mr. Chaffetz is saying, in fact I'm pretty sure of it, is we have to declare war on the states of Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Is that what we have to do?
Well, I hope not. As I said, I think the inner circle of the focus is going to be on Afghanistan, where I think we will be at war. I think there is something, however, he has said that's very true, which is 20 years ago, the United States government took the lead in developing an international consensus that the use and support of terrorism was no longer acceptable, and we did a pretty good job of building that consensus during the 80s. That has largely been lost during the 90s. And we've got to rebuild that consensus now. We've got to get serious about it when we say that we consider, for example, the countries he named, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. When we say they're terrorist-supporting states, then our policy has to follow that through to the consequences, and we have to insist that our allies agree. For example, our allies have been falling all over themselves to sign commercial agreements with Iran. In fact, we have also got the possibility of putting sanctions on those countries which have been waived by the previous administration and by this administration. Syria has the headquarters of a dozen terrorist groups, known terrorist groups who operate in the open in Damascus, terrorist groups which have killed Israeli and other citizens in just this past year. They operate freely in Damascus. Syria allows more than a dozen terrorist training camps to continue to operate in the Bekaa Valley, though it has been raised with them for more than 15 years. Those kinds of things have simply got to be stopped. And in the end, if they don't stop them, we may have to take military action. But it seems to me that's not the immediate concern now. The immediate concern now is to take some steps that show that we are really serious about terrorism, to take steps which broaden that beyond the immediate targets of Afghanistan and bin Laden, and to create this new international consensus.
Judy Miller, pick up on something that Zev alluded to, that the next time it's not going to be 5,000, but God knows how many. You just co-authored a book on germ warfare. Do you take, and there was a report, I should mention, in an Arab newspaper just yesterday that Osama bin Laden had trumpeted the fact that he says thousands of young supporters of his have studied chemical, biological, nuclear warfare, prepared to martyr themselves for it. Without getting into the assessment of that, do you take seriously the fact that we, the United States, are under potential threat for an attack in the chemical or biological field?
Well, if I didn't take that threat seriously, I wouldn't have written this book. I think that I started out, Jeff, very, very skeptically. I did not believe that biological weapons were a real threat to this country. I thought that all the people issuing these warnings were kind of looking for a new enemy. And the more I looked at the spread of this very dangerous technology and how relatively easy this was to do compared to the enormous expense and difficulty of a nuclear infrastructure that you need to make a weapon, the more of a no-brainer it seemed. And my colleagues and I concluded that this really was the 21st century weapon for what President Bush has called the 21st century wars.
Well, okay. When I stood on the roof here at CNN, 2 miles north of the World Trade Center with my colleague Aaron Brown, and looked at the smoke billowing across lower Manhattan, I will confess to you that one of my thoughts was, suppose they brought something with them on those planes. If that is the case, then is it too alarmist to say we may have to go in and declare war on every state that is harboring groups that have the potential and the willingness to use germ warfare against the West?
Well, you know, I think there are a lot of steps short of that the administration is going to start to take. But the first thing they can really do is make good on the previous administration's promise to, quote, drain the swamp. I mean, that was Mike Sheehan's great pledge. He was the former director of counterterrorism for the State Department, and he said what you have to do to get rid of these networks is drain the swamp in which they live. And under the Clinton administration, I have to say that some progress was made in eliminating the countries that play host to these groups. And now we have to concentrate on the rest of them.
Before I turn to the last question and get a comment from each of you, I want, Zev, for you to take us a little more personally into this issue. You lived in Israel for 30 years. It's a state that has never lived outside of conflict and threat. Do you get used to it? I mean, do you go out at night and put that thought behind you, or is it always with you?
You get used to it, but in the Israeli reality, you mentioned that I lived in Israel for 30 years. I served in the Army for close to 30 years, in the active Army and the reserve. So does everyone. We learn to be careful, and we learn that we have to be proactive. One of the things that is very hard for Americans to do is to stare evil in the face. And if you want to combat evil, if you want to fight Islamic and Arab terrorism, and I don't call them generically terrorism because we're talking about Islamic and Arab terrorism, you have to call them by their proper name. You have to put your finger on where they are. You have to go after them, and you have to finish the job.
But you've also were born in America and live here now. This is a country that is almost, in this sense, the mirror image of Israel, right, Judy? We've never lived with anything approaching threat, not even in World War II. Can a country like ours learn?
I can tell you that if we don't learn in this country, if America doesn't learn, there will be disastrous consequences. And I don't think America needs to learn. The governments, the armies of Iran and Iraq and Syria are not so formidable. Israel is a 5 million person state, and it's been fighting these morons successfully for 30, 40, 50 years.
But Sev, you still have suicide bombers, and you have more of them every day.
That's right.
So,
And,
how is that a victory?
It's the victory. First of all, the victory is that Israel is there, and it's getting bigger and stronger and richer and more free as time goes on. But the point is that we have to deal with reality, and now reality has showed up in Manhattan. The reality of the Arab and Islamic Middle East is here. You are, as we are, the enemy of these people. And they will do here what they've done in Israel. They will try to kill as many people as possible, and they will do it very efficiently.
Let me turn to the. But before I turn to you, Mr. Bremer, I just want to get from Judith Miller a reaction to that. Chaffetz says the only solution is to go in and dismantle these states.
I don't think that's possible. I mean, my own view, I don't think that it may be necessary. I think these states want ultimately not to be isolated. And if the rest of the world means what it says about joining America in this campaign, I think they will find themselves truly isolated, and that hopefully the use of military force will not be necessary. But Jeff, I want to say one more thing. I think it's very dangerous. We're on a very slippery slope here. The terrorists win if we become the enemy that we are fighting. If we live in fear, if we do violent things that kill innocent people, we become them, and they will gloat at this victory. So it's very difficult to fight on one hand and maintain our democratic values on the other.
Mr. Bremer, I want to bring you in and ask what I suppose is in one sense, the toughest question. How will we know when we've won? We knew how we won in Japan. They surrendered on a aircraft carrier. I remember, seeing those pictures in history. How will we know when we've won this war?
Well, first of all, fighting terrorism is more like fighting crime. Terrorism has been here since recorded history began, and it's always going to be here. So there is no final victory in the sense that terrorism is stamped out any more than you can stamp out crime. A legitimate goal for foreign policy is to get terrorism down to a point where it does not dominate our foreign policy, where we conduct our relations with other nations on other bases of political and diplomatic interchange, economic interchange, free trade, and so forth. But we need to be a bit realistic. We're not going to eliminate terrorism. It's always going to be there. There always will be vulnerabilities. And as Judy Miller said, the real challenge for a country like America, the great strength of America, is an ability to wage this kind of a war while protecting our civil liberties that we have fought and died for over 200 years, and to keep those in balance with the measures we're now going to have to take, security measures we're now going to have to take. I think we can do that. We've done it before. We are a great and resilient nation, and we will come through this.
But let me just pursue this analogy, false though it may be. When we defeated Japan and Germany, we killed countless hundreds of thousands of their civilians as well as military people. We occupied their capitals. And within a relatively short amount of time, Germany and Japan became functioning, healthy democracies allied with the West. There's no chance. Is there any chance that that could possibly happen with states like Iran, Iraq, and Syria? I mean, even if it were militarily possible?
Well, I don't think you can generalize. I think Iran is already a democracy. They have elections there. You can't say the same thing about Iraq, and Syria has basically phony elections. So you've got to look at each of them individually in terms of their culture and their history and their background. I'm not advocating. I share Judy's concern. I'm not advocating that we go to war with everybody who's in the neighborhood. I think if we act vigorously in the narrow case of Afghanistan and the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, we will find that we can change the whole dynamic of the region, where people will begin to respect that we are really serious, we really mean business, and if we can get our allies to stand with us, we'll find that we can get a lot of things done without having to use force in the second ring, that is, that